Melbourne Rebels, folks, are gone for 2025. They have not had their Super Rugby license renewed by Rugby Australia. This is the end of the road for the Rebels. They have one regular season game to go and at least one playoff game to go this 2024 season, and then that is the end. They're going to join the likes of the Force, the Kings, the Hawaris, the Sunwolves, the Cheetahs as sides who have been axed from Super Rugby. Why have they been axed? Is there a future for them to come back? Is this a good thing or a bad thing for Aussie Rugby? We'll go through it and you guys can let us know your thoughts. And also, what kind of contribution have they made to Super Rugby since 2011? Have they been a good addition or have they been a bit of a waste of space? Maybe somewhere a bit in the middle. But yeah, the question about whether this is good or bad for Aussie Rugby is certainly going to be one at the kind of the forefront of this, because it's been long talked about that the Aussies don't have the depth to sustain 5 Super Rugby teams. People often talk about those Super 12 days when there were only 3 Aussie Rugby sides as kind of being one of the golden eras, like the balance was right in terms of the amount of teams that each country had. All the teams were kind of more or less competitive, at least to a certain degree. But then with the addition, when they expanded up to 18 teams, we saw genuinely a few teams who were kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel. But is this going to be true for Aussie Rugby? I think we do see a little bit of the history from when the Force was scrapped, that at least the Rebels anyway took a bit of a bolstering, but we'll get to their stats in a while. So I think in the short term, certainly we will see, if assuming what happens goes according to the usual script of these players finding other sides, most likely within the Aussie Rugby scene, those sides should be boosted in terms of the competitiveness. Like I said, we've seen it in Australia before. We've seen it in England with the Premiership lost 3 of their teams, London Irish and Wasps, and Worcester all went under. Those players inevitably, for the most part, found jobs with other teams, especially the ones in England. They seem to kind of improve in their competitiveness. I would say short-term benefit certainly is there. What you lose out on, though, is just those job opportunities for budding young rugby players. We have seen a few, I wouldn't say it's a heck of a lot, but there's certainly be a few Victorian-based players, where Melbourne is, come through the ranks and represent the Wallabies. I think Valetini's a Victorian, isn't he? He started with the Melbourne Rising, and Rob Leota's a proud Victorian. So there's certainly a few job opportunities lost. Like the sports scene in Australia is very competitive. League teams snap up union players all the time, and with one less professional outfit, that's just a bunch of fewer contracts that are up for grabs. But the crux of the matter is the Rebels have been in debt. That came out earlier. They're in big time debt, millions of dollars, especially to the tax man. And this consortium which was looking to take them over, their offer to take over the Rebels has been rejected. Rugby Australia basically said the application didn't demonstrate financial viability because, according to Rugby Australia, a lot of their estimates on how much money they could bring in once they took over the Rebels were a bit optimistic. Rugby Australia kind of doubled down by saying since 2011, the Rebels haven't been financially sustainable. They've been basically a money loser every year since they joined in. But what is their on-field record like? Have the Rebels been a worthwhile addition to Super Rugby? They've been here since 2011. If we chuck their record up for all of those years, you can see more or less every year they have a losing record. There's only 2 seasons I can find where they don't have a negative points difference, and those years kind of have big time asterisks next to them. The first few years when it's Super 15, it starts all right. Like their first game is awful. They get beaten by the Waratahs 43-0. Phil War scores in that game for the Tars, but they win their second game. They finish bottom of the log with a 3-13 record. Then the next year they get 4-12, 5-11, 4-12. So their record's kind of always the bottom third of the teams. And their points difference is always, well over negative 100 points. So they're pretty much one of the whipping boys for their first few years. But that kind of makes sense. And from my memory of those sides back in those days, they seem to have this recruitment policy of wanting to recruit flashy backs instead of kind of hard-working forwards. So they often had a really nice back line, but got dominated up front. Then we switch to 2016 when we get to the Super 18 competition for a couple of years. They have a decent year in 2016 where they go 7-8, but then they have a catastrophic year in 2017 where they finished below the Sunwolves. Did I even mention the Sunwolves? They're another side that got axed They finished 18th out of 18 teams, points difference of negative 333. 1 win, 1 draw, 13 losses. Really, really bad season. Attendance drops certainly below 10,000 for the first time in their history. And it's an awful year for the Rebels. However, that's the year that they decided Super Rugby's too big with 18 teams. They cut the Chiefs, they cut the Cheetahs, they cut the Kings, and they cut the Force. So the Force's players, many of them joined the Rebels, and they have a good year the next year. 2018, 7-9. That's the closest they get in a regular Super Rugby season to making the playoffs. They finished 9th out of 15 teams. Minus 21 is their points difference. Very, very close to making the playoffs, but not to be. Similar record the next year, and then we get COVID in 2020 where they finish with 3 wins, 3 losses before the season is canned. That's one of the years when they were still in the positive points difference territory. Then we get a couple of years of Super Rugby AU where they are decent but not great, and then Trans-Tasman, they get absolutely flogged. They don't win a game. And then we finally get back to this kind of current pattern at the moment, which is Super Rugby Pacific. They finished 4-10, 4-10, not good enough for the playoffs. In a competition where it's really easy to make the playoffs, 8 out of 12 teams make the playoffs, so you've got to be pretty bad not to make the playoffs. They didn't make the playoffs those years. This year they have made the playoffs with their 5-8 record. It's guaranteed they will get at least one playoff game. They still have one regular season game to go. So they are going to still finish with a negative record. So their record this season is going to be comparable to those years where they missed the playoffs before, but they were just playing in a competition which was harder to make the playoffs. So honestly, the Rebels' record for having over 10 years is not great. You would have thought, like, you've seen other teams kind of yo-yo up and down the Super Rugby table. The Lions used to be a whipping boy, then they became really good during the old Super Rugby. The Reds have been good, have been bad. The Waratahs have been good, have been bad at that time, whereas the Rebels have basically been kind of consistently bad. Who have they beaten during that time? Most of the sides they beat were the Australian sides. Their best side to play was the Western Force. 22% of the Rebels' wins over those years have come against the Force. Then the Brumbies, then the Tars and the Reds. So almost 60% of their wins have come against Aussie sides. They have beaten a few of the Kiwi sides, mostly the Highlanders. 5 times they've beaten the Blues, 3 times they've beat the Crusaders a couple of times, including a win down in Christchurch. They have also won once at Eden Park. So they have beaten New Zealand sides a few times, I think 3 times in their history. I think it was Dunedin, Eden Park and Christchurch. They never beat the Hurricanes or Chiefs away, as far as I'm aware, but they've beaten each of those sides once. South African sides they did not have a good time against. Remember, small forward pack often the Rebels. Didn't bode well. They never won a game in South Africa. They did draw with the Sharks once, 9 apiece. But yeah, they struggled. They beat the Bulls once, the Sharks once, the Lions once, the Stormers once, and the Cheetahs twice. They had a good record against the Sunwolves. They beat them 5 times. And in more recent times, they've had a decent run against Moana Pacifica and against the Drua. But yeah, they've not really made a huge mark on the Aussie teams, New Zealand teams, or the South African teams if we're looking at the numbers. So yeah, we'll have to see. As I said, short-term wise, I am kind of optimistic that this is going to be a boost for Aussie Rugby. As I said, longer term, it is a bit of a concern. But then again, you kind of need the game to be decent now. I was all for Super Rugby expansion back in the day, and that was very misplaced. I was dead wrong about that one, and the competition lacked the competitiveness it needs. I do think if Super Rugby, as it currently stands, is going to engage more fans, it needs to be competitive. This year's been a bit of a different story with the Crusaders struggling, and with the sides like the Reds being on a bit of a better run. It's been a little bit more interesting than previous years, but certainly, we need more competitive sides. Now, what's going to happen in the future? Well, apparently this consortium's preparing a lawsuit to fight back against what Rugby Australia has put forward. We'll have to wait and see what happens with that one. Phil Waugh didn't rule out a potential return if they can get the finances on the table, but I can certainly understand why they don't want to be just propping up a team which loses money every year. Melbourne is insanely competitive for sports. So many AFL teams. AFL's the number one game. They've got a really successful league team who don't sell the stadium out every week. I mean, Melbourne is not a rugby union town. It's not a rugby league town. It's all about AFL. They've got football teams. They've got a heap of sports teams. Their sports teams ratio per population must be one of the highest in the world because they've just got so many AFL teams based in Melbourne. But yeah, it was always going to be a bit of an uphill battle. Will they get replaced by the Jaguares? Maybe. That's been talked about earlier in the year if the Rebels were to go under. But if we don't get a replacement for them, at the minute we're looking at a competition with 11 teams, which is not a great number. Imagine if it's 8 playoff teams, only 3 teams don't make it. That'd be really bizarre. But anyway, you guys let us know your thoughts. What are you thinking about the Rebels? Is this good for Aussie rugby? Or is this going to be a bad one? Obviously, feel for all the players and all the staff who are about to kind of become unemployed. But fingers crossed everyone can pick up jobs elsewhere sooner rather than later. You guys let us know your thoughts, and I'll talk to you guys again soon. See you later.